Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perikei Mishnah Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burchai, Israelov, Chana bad Miriam, Sason ben Raya, and Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam began Eden, Amen, and Lavdi ben Chaim Lechaim, v'derifua shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, Betok Shach Chole Israel, and Achlama Merav ben Amin, Otzion Chai ben Dvorah. The Mishnah discusses another real estate transaction that can lead to rabbinically forbidden interest. Machar lo et sadeh, if someone sells a field to another person, v'natan lo miktzat damim, and the buyer gives the seller part of the money. V'amar lo, and the seller says to him, matai shetirtzeh haveh maot v'tol et shelach, whenever you want, bring the rest of the money and take what is yours, the field, and it will be considered yours from now. And if you do not bring the rest of the money, the sale will be nullified and I will return your money to you. Meaning, when you give me the rest of the money, the field will belong to you retroactively from when you made the first payment. But if you do not give me the rest of the money, then the sale is canceled and I will give you back the first payment. Asur, it is forbidden for either the buyer or the seller to take the crops of this field until we see what happens. This is because it might result in a form of rabbinically forbidden interest. If the field ends up belonging to the buyer, then any produce taken by the seller while he was waiting for the final payment is a benefit he is getting in return for waiting for his money. If the buyer ends up bringing the rest of the money, then the sale takes effect retroactively from the time of the first payment. If so, the seller really has no right to take produce from the field from that time on. Why then is he taking from crop? It is because he is taking an extra payment in return for waiting to receive the rest of his money from the buyer. This is not biblically forbidden because the debt did not come through a loan, but through a sale. Nevertheless, it is rabbinically forbidden. And if the field ends up staying with the seller, then any produce taken by the buyer while the sale was still pending is a benefit he is getting for letting the seller use the money of the first payment while the sale was still pending. If the buyer is unable to come up with the rest of the money or simply changes his mind and the sale is canceled, it turns out that the buyer had no right to take anything from the field because it never belonged to him. Why then is he taking crops? It is in return for allowing the seller to use the money of the first payment until the sale is decided. This money is like a loan from the buyer to the seller until it is returned to him. Since neither the buyer nor the seller may take the produce until we see whether the sale is completed, the crops are given to a third person to hold. If the sale is eventually completed, they are given to the buyer, and if not, they are given to the seller. The next case involves a loan arrangement under which the lender might end up collecting a field that is worth more than the amount of the loan. Hilvao al sadeo, if someone lends another person money on the security of his field, meaning that if the borrower does not repay the loan, the lender can take that field. Va'amarlo, and the lender said to the borrower, Im Iyata noten li mikan vat shalosh shanim, if you do not give me back the money within the next 3 years, literally from now until 3 years, harei sheli, then the field is mine as of now. Harei Shelod, and if the borrower does not pay back within 3 years, the field is the lender's. This is permitted even if the field is worth more than the loan, because the lender actually owned the field from the moment he gave the borrower the money. This means that the money he gave the borrower was never really a loan, but a payment for the field. He simply bought the field at a cheap price. Now, a loan is where the lender is repaid sometime after he gives the money, where he receives property in return for the money at the time he gives the money. It is not a loan, but a sale. Since the agreement in this case was for the lender to take ownership of the field from the time he gave the money, if the borrower did not repay it within 3 years, this is not a loan, but a sale with the condition that if the money is repaid within 3 years, the sale will be nullified. Therefore, even if the field is worth more than the amount of the loan, there is no problem of interest. This is even rabbinically permitted because it resembles a sale, not a loan. However, here too, the crops must be given to a third person to hold until we know whether the sale goes through or not. This is because the deal can be considered a sale only if the lender ends up with the field. If the borrower does repay him within 3 years and gets back his field, then the deal really was a loan because the lender got back money, not a field. And anything the lender took from the field during those years was interest on that loan. And if the borrower does not pay back the loan, anything he took from the field would be considered stolen, since it turns out that the field really belonged to the lender during those 3 years. V'chach haya Baitos ben Zonin oseh al pi chachamim, and this is what Baitos, the son of Zonin, would do with the approval of the sages. The Mishnah is proving that this is the accepted halacha by recalling the practice of Baitos, who lived shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple, who would make this kind of loan with the approval of the great sages of that day. and that is end of Mishnah Gimel. The following Mishnah Dalet, deals with interest related to investments. It was common in the times of the Mishnah for a person who had money to invest or merchandise to sell to make a deal with a broker to take the merchandise and find buyers for it, or to buy merchandise with the money and then sell it at a profit and divide the profits with the investor. Since all investments involve risk, and since the investor wanted the broker to share in the risks as well as the profit, these deals were typically arranged in the following manner. Half the investment, whether it was money or merchandise, would be considered a loan to the broker. Technically, the arrangement was for the broker to be responsible for the loss or drop in value of half the merchandise or money. However, when someone receives something and is responsible to pay it back in full no matter what happens to it, he has in effect received the loan. Since the broker is responsible to pay back half the losses, he has in effect borrowed half that investment, while the other half would be considered the investor's property. Since the broker puts the half he quote-unquote borrowed back into the investment, he and the investor are now equal partners in it. The broker then buys and sells with all of it and tries to earn a profit for the investment. If it makes money, they each take up the profits, and if it loses money, they each suffer half the losses. This is because the broker must repay the half that was a loan even if the investment loses money, the same as with any loan. For example, if the investor put up 200 zuz, half the money, 100 zuz, is considered a loan to the broker, while the other half represents the investor's share. If the investment ends up losing half its value, the remaining 100 zuz is divided between them, and the broker must still pay the investor the 100 zuz he quote-unquote borrowed from him. The final result is that the investor ends up with 150 zuz, 50 less than he started with, and the broker is out 50 zuz. Similarly, with profits, if the investment earned 100 zuz profit, the investor receives half 50 zuz as the return on half of it, his half of the investment, while the broker receives the other half as the return on his half of the investment. The broker must also give the investor back the 200 zuz that was invested, half because it still belongs to the investor, and the other half is repayment of the loan the broker took from him at the beginning of the investment. The final result is that the investor ends up with 250 zuz, 50 more than he started with, and the broker receives 50 zuz. Although this means that the investor may get back more than he gave the broker, this is not an interest payment, since the extra money is profit from the investor's half of the investment, not from the loan. Our Mishnah will now teach that there is one more requirement that must be met to prevent such a deal from being forbidden as interest. The Mishnah begins with the case of investing with the storekeeper. One may not have a storekeeper sit and sell produce in exchange for half of the earnings, meaning one may not tell a storekeeper, here is produce at a certain price, sell it for a higher price and we will split the costs. This deal is made according to the arrangement that we described. The storekeeper is also responsible for half the losses because he receives half the produce as a loan. Nor may one give a storekeeper money with which to buy produce to sell in exchange for half of the earnings, unless one also gives the storekeeper his wages as a worker. This is because half the produce or money is a loan from the investor to the storekeeper, and the other half is money that belongs to the investor. Since the storekeeper is an equal partner with the investor in this deal, and yet he is doing all the work, buying and selling on behalf of both of them, if he does not get paid for his half of the work, it is because he is performing a free service for the investor in exchange for the loan he received from him. This free service is forbidden interest. The investor must therefore pay the storekeeper for half his work. Only half the work is being done for the investor. The other half is being done on behalf of the storekeeper's own share of the investment. Now, the same rule applies to someone investing in raising chickens or young animals. One may not give eggs to a farmer to have his hens sit on them in order to hatch chicks, which he will then raise for half the profits and losses, meaning he will get half the profits, but he will also be responsible for half of any losses. For example, if the chicks die. This is another example of the type of investment that we described earlier in the Mishnah. Half the eggs the farmer will receive will belong to the investor, while the other half will be a loan to the farmer. Then shamin agarin usiachin lemechza. Nor may one assess the value of calves or colts, young horses, and give them to a herdsman to raise for half the profits and losses. Very young cows and horses need to be raised and fed until they grow large enough to take care of themselves. This involves a lot of work. People would therefore give their young animals to professional herders to do the work for them. One way of arranging to pay for this was to make the type of arrangement explained in the Mishnah, giving the herder half the profits and making him responsible for half the losses. For example, if the animals die, therefore half the animals are given to him as a loan and half simply as the owner's share of the investment. In order that it should be clear how much the herdsman is responsible for, the value of the young animals is assessed before they are given to him. The profit in this case is the difference in value between the very young animals he receives and the animals he gives back to the investor. Elim ken noten lo sechar amalom zono, unless then, so again, these two cases were not allowed unless the investor gives the farmer or herdsman payment for his work in raising the investor's half of the animals and for half his food that he feeds the animals. Providing the worker food for free is rabbinically forbidden as interest. The Mishnah now teaches when it is not necessary to pay for the work. However, a herdsman may accept calves or colts for half the profits without first assessing their value, in which case he is not responsible for half the losses. Wherever the receiver is expected to be responsible for half the losses, the value of the property is assessed and written down before it is given to him. If they are given to him without such an assessment, the agreement does not call for him to be responsible for half the losses, and whenever the receiver is not responsible for the losses, the arrangement is not considered a loan. If so, he is not receiving any of the animals as a loan. He is simply caring for the owner's animals in exchange for half the profits. Therefore, there is no need to pay him for his work or the feed. Since there is no loan, the work cannot be considered an interest payment. Rather, it is being done in exchange for half the profits. Now, as a side issue, the Mishnah teaches how long a herdsman is expected to raise the young animals in his care. He must raise the calves and colts until they are grown to a third of their full size before he may return them and split the profits with the investor. If the agreement was to raise a young donkey, he must raise it until it can carry a load. These were the standard arrangements in the time of the Mishnah. The Mishnah teaches that unless they specifically make a different arrangement, neither side is allowed to back out of it until the young animals reach the sizes mentioned here. And that is the Nabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.